Appreciate everybody coming today. I know we're still waiting for Stevie Wakes. But I just wanted to get together, talk about the May financials that will be on the consent agenda at the July meeting. Go through the numbers a little bit and getting questions, make sure that we're all seeing the same thing and all thinking the same thing. And but from there, I just started. So Rob, is anybody online?
Amber is connected, but there are no members of the public.
Okay, sounds good. Here's a copy of the income statement for May. So I'll give Stevie a few minutes to kind of get here, but just as a general rule, as we look at the overall numbers, we're really on pace with where budget sits. And so as a general rule, when you look month to month and category to category, we will see some fluctuations, between what we thought and what are happening. But just as a general rule, on the total picture, we're really close to budget. And so we're in pretty good shape overall, from where we would expect to be. So, one note, just to point out, is General Motors has provided us a recently updated revenue forecast. And so we do have those numbers that they were forecasting. The interesting thing with that forecast is it was before the Equinox announcement. So if you've seen General Motors announce just a few weeks back that they are now relocating the production of the Equinox facility to Kansas City, Kansas from Mexico.
Oh.
So they are going to make the Chevy Bolt at this location. So they're retooling for the Chevy Bolt, but they did announce here a few weeks back that the Equinox, the electric Equinox, will be relocating from Mexico to Kansas City, Kansas. So I don't know if that will impact their forecast or whether these numbers were already baking that in and they already knew about that.
And those are both battery operated.
They are both battery operated units. So that'll be really fascinating to kind of see, what that means overall. So again, we can kind of talk through, what those forecasts kind of look like is, so just from their perspective alone, on a May power side, their billing levels are about 32% lower this May than last May. And again, that's really largely due to them retooling, right, and not having any lines in place. Stevie Wakes, welcome.
So will it be the same? I mean, will they be building from scratch like they were gas powered cars?
I think they really will be. So I think the interesting thing will be, how does the base platform work in terms of, does that get shipped in and then you build on top of that platform? Because a lot of those vehicles have a power platform on the electric side.
Okay.
And so therefore they may ship that piece in and then build the other 2/3 of the.
It's like, I remember not too long ago, they made that addition, that big paint
Yeah.
shop. So, Stevie, the fridge is open. Do you want to
How
soak
many years before we
our water?
have any impact from the
Thank you so much, Rob.
data centers if they come online?
So on the data center side, currently, the expectation is that we would start serving them by mid-year 2027. And so we would start seeing that revenue probably the summer season of 2027, assuming those data centers come online. So we have all three projects that we're having discussions with today. Expect at least the first buildings to come online in 2027. And then go.
All the talk of that has just been like locally, there's data center, they're trying to put them in the Midwest, whatever. I was just reading this article not too long ago about globally where they are. Many in China. And then I started thinking, we want all of our data stored in China. That might be an argument against people who don't want them in their backyard or what.
Yes.
I I guess I didn't even think or realize about the global aspect.
The global picture.
It.
Yeah, and so I do think one of the things from a political standpoint that's at least in discussions is how much do we care to win the AI race? And therefore that data, right? And so, and it'll be interesting to see if both parties kind of fall in line with really caring about winning that AI race.
Mhm.
And therefore, does that change their stance on other generation types and those type of things, right? And the push has been over the last, I'll say, decade and a half to close thermal resources, predominantly coal resources, and retool that for wind and solar assets. But if your bigger decision is to win the AI race or the data center race, then therefore you may have to reposition yourself in terms of, am I comfortable with having thermal resources or more thermal resources than I was before? And just adding renewables to that mix, but not pushing to close down resources that are currently operating, those type of things. So I think that'll be a really interesting dynamic.
Think about.
with different parties in terms
Or nuclear or something.
and
Yeah.
nuclear is a fascinating option. And I honestly, I get questions on nuclear every time I leave the house, I swear.
Really?
I really do. Everybody wants to talk about nuclear and it makes some sense. Is nuclear can operate at a flat level at peak capacity for years straight, right? So it'll be 3 years before any maintenance outage at all.
Doesn't damage the atmosphere.
So there is no pollution emitting gases that come out of nuclear. There are plenty of challenges with nuclear, right? You have a fuel rod that will live on for 10,000 years.
Years, yeah.
So that is a real challenge that the US nor any other country in the world has really solved. Nobody wants that in their own backyard when those are spent. And so that's a real challenge. But the other challenge is on the nuclear side is only one nuclear facility has been built in the last 50 years. Only one. Vogtle got built just a handful of years ago, but it had so many cost overruns that unit on a output basis was 27 times more expensive than building a similar sized gas unit. 27 times. So if we're going to move the way of the nuclear facility, the process needs to get more refined and more efficient.
Looks just like.
I thought they had a small modular nuclear type.
Looked like a
Thanks.
cement silo. kind of.
It really does.
That's what it looks like to me.
It really does. And so it is amazing that we haven't done a better job from I'll say, government and standpoint to make those more streamlined in terms of what process it takes to actually build those things. Because again, it was 27 cost overruns, or 27 times the cost of gas. So it was very, very expensive. So the big push now, or at least the new push, is the small modular nukes. And so most nukes are, I'll say, 1,000 megawatts or larger. So really large scale generating facilities. The modular nukes can be 300 megawatt facilities. You could put them in smaller spaces, those type of things. There are no commercial small modular nukes at this point. And so it's really hard to know where they're at in the process, where the government's at in that process. But there are people investing a lot of money, Microsoft being one of those, in that technology to say, hey, we believe this could be a real game changer for data centers to locate near those facilities. Because again, they're going to have 99% uptime, unlike other thermal facilities and really renewable facilities. So I know data centers are keen to those ideas. It'll just be whether we can actually get there. So it's up in the air,
I
but
always feel like by the time we get there, it's not AI anymore. It's the
Yes.
next
yes.
new thing. I don't know.
And so this window of data centers will be really interesting, right? Is it a long window, or are we really talking about a 3 to 5 year window and the chips get more efficient and these type of things, and then the load requirements shrink back down? I don't know. My only I'll say my historical context a little bit is we capture more data today than we ever captured before. And the idea that we won't capture more data tomorrow than we do today, I find that really hard to believe, right? One of the things that we actually haven't done, which was the talking point, I'll say, really 10 years ago, is smart homes. Smart homes haven't developed like people thought smart homes would develop. But is that still on the horizon, right? Are we still getting to that point? We have the Alexas of the world and those type of things.
Well, there's a lot of people that have,
Yeah.
things that can open their garage door,
Yep.
things that can, it's just not totally.
Yes, they haven't developed in terms of a total picture of, hey, all of my apps, all of my stuff works. I walk in the door, they know it's me. And I like this music on and I like the oven to turn on because I'm ready to cook my chicken.
But that's,
Yes, it is.
I don't know if I'm ready for that.
It'll be fascinating to see if we go down that road. But that was the thought 10 years ago that by this point we would be there. But honestly, on the EV side or on the, I'll say, self-driving vehicle side, right, is I'll say over 5 years ago, they thought by 2025, self-driving cars would be proficient all throughout the United States. And yes, we have systems in, I'll say, California and LA and Austin and these different places with Waymo and, Tesla and these type of companies. And so they're really fascinating, but they haven't become part of our normal daily life yet. We don't see consumer cars that are self-driving, right? We do see hands-free. I can't remember the Ford name for it, but essentially you can drive hands-free on the highway as long as you're, Blue Cruise, those type of things that are, yes, they're partially there, but it's not like you're taking a nap and say, I'll see you when we get there, right? So it'll be really fascinating to see if we develop it. And some of it is just us, right, as people getting comfortable with the idea of either riding in a vehicle that you're not driving or driving beside a vehicle that nobody is driving, right? So when I went to LA a few months back, these Waymos are everywhere, but it just takes a minute to get comfortable with that car next to you with nobody in that front seat just driving alongside of you, right? So some of it is our own challenges of getting past what we're comfortable with, right? We live it every day in terms of the guy eating the cheeseburger or putting on makeup or reading a text or whatever it is. So we look for those things and we're like, that guy, I'm gonna tend to get over here, right? So we all have those things and we'll just continue to watch those things. But it is a fascinating world to see where all that stuff goes. But
we think they will finalize the deal for data centers this year.
I do. I think
Isn't it for a
Unified
vote?
government.
Isn't it on a vote for Thursday night?
it is. It is at the full.
The one.
But I'm talking about the details of the agreement.
So yes, so I do. I think we are very close. Again, we will work hand in glove with the unified government to make sure that what they're putting together and what we're putting together works really well together and that we both agree on timelines and everything else, because neither party can do it on their own. Like if we say we don't have power, I don't care what the unified government says they want to do. If we can't deliver power, they can't show up, right? And if the unified government says, I'm not having any of those buildings in my territory, I don't care if I can deliver power or not, they're not coming to the territory, right? So this is one of those projects, or these are projects that both sides have to be really closely connected on, because other projects that I'll say low power users that have light industrial jobs, these type of things, is we don't need to be necessarily at the forefront of those discussions of what the unified government's doing for jobs and different things, because we can deliver power to those type of customers. But this is just one of those things that both of us need to agree on lots of things. But I do anticipate that this year and probably before the end of the third quarter, that we would have an agreement in place with at least one data center with financial assurance in place and those type of things, with a plan to ramp up that load. And again, I would expect that ramp up to begin in 2027. And then depending on the project, it would either be 27, 28, 29, or may stagger in a different format, but that's kind of what we're looking at.
So that the main concern with that from, as you know, the Sierra Club has been with the coal plant and the usage of, well, their main concern is, I guess, the contamination of the environment with the coal power plant. And whether or not we will continue to boost emissions with the coming of the power plant. Yeah, I'm sorry, with the data center.
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, this is, so all of our generating facilities, whether it be our Nearman facility, whether it be our CT4 facility, which is a natural gas facility, any of those facilities operate based on how SPP determines those operations need to happen, right? So we don't operate those facilities saying, hey, I want to operate this. We have a whole list of parameters in terms of how we can operate it. And then SPP says, here is the price, here is the voltage support issues we have, here is all the things with the grid that need to happen to support that. And they will decide what units are best at serving that support, right? And so in a lot of ways, whether a data center located on this side of the river in Kansas, Kansas, or on that side of the river in Kansas City, Missouri, it likely would not change the output of Nearman by 1 degree. It would likely be the exact same output, because really this whole metropolitan area has a level of congestion that's generally higher than most other areas of SPP, just because it is an urban area and there's limited amount of generation within this urban area. So Nearman, CT4, those facilities would likely operate just as much if the data center was on the other side of the river than this side of the river. But as a general rule, we do expect load to increase across all of SPP. And so all generating units will likely operate at higher levels than they may have operated in the past. Again, with that said is, we have to bring on, we and everybody else has to bring on more generating resources to, one, meet the changes with SPP without the load. And that's the bigger haircuts that we talked about, right? So the amount of wind accreditation is going down. Even thermal units are getting haircuts. So all of us load serving entities will have to get additional resources. And so the more that those resources are, I'll say, renewable in nature, those resources always go onto the system first before any thermal resources go on, because they're going on at effectively, we'll take the tax piece out of it a little bit, at effectively $0, right? So the tax piece will actually allow resources to go into the marketplace at like negative $35 because of the way the tax system works around the investment tax credit stuff. Again, Trump is talking about rolling back some of those type of things. We'll see what happens. Again, I don't know. Granted, that's a 2028 timeframe that he's speaking about today. And so it still gives a little bit of time, but it would change that whole dynamic a little bit. But effectively, renewables go into the marketplace at $0. No thermal unit can obviously compete with $0 because everything costs money to operate. And so thermal units are always the add-on on top of the renewables, right? And so if you add more renewables from a output standpoint, you may have more thermal resources, but they may actually operate less, because thermal is more for capacity accreditation or the ability to produce when you have to produce, where renewables will just produce whenever the ability to produce exists, right? So if it's windy day, wind's gonna blow. They don't care if you're using power or not. It's gonna blow until they shut it off because there's just way too much of it. So I think it'll be both ways. I think you'll see, and I think from our portfolio, for example, depending on what data center we see, we will absolutely see a growth in renewables, especially at the front side of these projects, right? So one of the things we've done already, and this was with the data center in mind, but also with the integrated resource plan in mind, that we purchased 96 megawatts of solar that will be coming online late in 26. And so during the integrated resource plan, the opinion was that paper capacity or make-believe capacity, that I'm pointing at another machine somewhere in SPP, would be the cheapest alternative. What we've seen over the last really 6 to 12 months is the cost of that capacity has went up about fourfold of what it was before that. And so now that solar resource that we brought online is cheaper than all the paper resources that we could find. And so therefore, not only does it bring longer term stability to that capacity accreditation, it also brings another, I'll say, diversification within our portfolio to diversify our mix even more, right? We had 1 megawatt of solar, but that's really small scale for our size.
And that comes on in 27?
26, so late 26, it'll be
Late
gone.
26.
So December 1, 26 is when its commercial operation date is. And so we will get that winter season for 26, but we think that'll be a really good resource just based on cost of all alternative resources, and then really give us a more diverse mix than we had before, because we're heavy wind, right? We even are heavier hydro with the government hydro stuff, but this will give us a more diverse mix within that renewable portfolio. And therefore, the nice thing with solar is it's on peak, right? It's really from 8 in the morning to about 4 in the afternoon is where that curve sits. And so that's when our load goes up, SPP's load goes up. And so it fits really well. If I was in California, I might think differently, right? They have that giant duck curve that's a real challenge for solar today. But that's because that's what they have populated out there is solar, where we populated wind, and therefore wind produces really low revenue value because it produces wind when we generally don't need it and we have so much of it, right? So until we get to a point where there's either enough batteries on the system to absorb that wind, or we change our profile of our load, right? And we use more load in April and October, we use more load at midnight, those type of things. But if your heavy residential load portfolio is, we all use our power at 5 PM in the afternoon, summertime, these type of things, right? And so data centers will really help smooth out that curve, even though we'll have a peak because we still exist. Data centers will use a lot of power in April, October, overnight, and that's really cheap power for the rest of us. And so it actually will help the entire grid be more efficient and absorb more wind versus curtailing that wind is what we do today. So
that we don't drive Angie nuts and talk about all the stuff that we should not.
that is not necessarily 100% finance related yet.
But it's on everybody's mind.
It is on everybody's mind. And so
Finance related years down the line.
Yeah.
hopefully the revenue side will be coming there, but we are on the finance side, we are working to put some, I'll say, tools in place that ensure that if we do bring in a large customer like that, that all other classes will be protected by doing these financial assurance agreements and allow them to fund, I'll say, letters of credit and those type of tools to ensure that if they don't come, that we didn't go buy assets that we don't need, right? Generating assets are expensive. Therefore, this pool of funds will be there to protect all of us in case they either don't come or they're not the size or scale that they said they would be. So those are definitely true things. So I do have the May income statement here. And so this is what will be going to the consent agenda next week, I guess it is, for July. And so in July, we plan on presenting the first quarter financial presentation. And then in August, we'll do the second quarter financial presentation. And so those will be the next 2 months. But kind of what I was telling these two, Stevie, is that although different categories are up and down from budget and to last year, overall, on an overall picture of the entire portfolio, we're really well positioned to budget and last year. And so as we look at it broadly, it looks very much like we would expect to. Some of the categories are higher and lower, and therefore that's part of the deal. And the biggest fluctuation really is going to be driven from fuel and purchase power. Both of those categories flow through our ERC because that's why they flow through the ERC, is because they're very volatile in nature, right? As fuel prices go up, it's going to impact, what our costs are. And so we see that when we go to the pump to fill up our car or anything like that. So those are just the nature of the beast. So we'll start on the overall. So the first page here. And go through kind of the revenue side. And so this is both electric and water. So on the residential sales side, we're down about, and so electric makes up the bulk of the overall revenue picture, right? So electric will always kind of dominate these numbers a little bit, but we'll get into both the electric and the water side as we get to that. But from a residential standpoint, on the revenue side, so this is the income side, it's about 2% below budget, and it's about 6% higher than last year's revenue on the residential side. Commercial side, we're up about 3% over budget, and we're flat with last year's sales. The industrial sales, so this is really the class that General Motors would sit in, right? So those entities that produce a good, and General Motors being the largest of those in that class. Its industrial sales are down about 11% to budget and down about 12% from last year. And so it's a little bigger number than we probably anticipated last year at this time. But based on the numbers we've seen for the first five months of this year, it's in line with where our expectations are. And so as I was speaking to them earlier, is General Motors as a rule is down 32% on the power side from May of last year. But they did provide us a forecast going forward. And so at the current time, we believe long-term that the total dollars or revenue off of General Motors will likely be about 8% lower than it has been historically or in the past. With that caveat being, these forecasts were developed prior to knowing that the Equinox model was coming back to Kansas City, Kansas. So the Equinox model previously was put together in Mexico, and about a few weeks back, I can't remember how many weeks back, General Motors made an announcement that was coming to Kansas City, Kansas. So I don't know if these forecast numbers from General Motors included that Equinox or not, because they sent it to us before that announcement, but they may have been aware of that and already put that in their forecast. So we're looking to get that information, whether that'll change that information a little bit. So it's from a retail sales perspective. So just on the retail side, we're just down 1% from budget overall, and we're flat with last year. So we're almost exactly where we would expect to be on a total retail sales perspective. And so that's really what we would focus on in terms of residential. It usually is more heavily weighted towards heating and cooling days. And so depending on how weather goes, it'll fluctuate year to year based on heating and cooling, right? So now that we're in a hot stretch here, we're going to see a lot more air conditioning use just because of that animal, where industrial sales use very little heating and cooling load as a percentage of their overall usage. And so we don't see that fluctuate as much by weather conditions itself. And then there at the very bottom of that page, the total operating revenues. And so that includes all the other activities, which are pull attachments, but really the biggest driver in this category is that wholesale market sales. So they're really during the first quarter of this year, we've seen wholesale market sales really balloon up. So we've seen higher prices in the marketplace and those type of things. And so the units ran really well during the first quarter. And so therefore we've seen, again, wholesale market sales of 8 million compared to a budget of 2.9 million for this year, and last year sales of 2.3 million. And so that's a good problem, and therefore total operating revenues are up about 6% overall from budget and 6% overall from last year. So that wholesale sales has really made a meaningful difference overall.
Who are we selling to?
So that is the marketplace in general. So there's no,
It's not like KMEA or
correct, Columbia.
Columbia.
Yep. So several years back, 15 plus years back at this point, we had an arrangement off the Nearman facility to sell wholesale power to KMEA
That's
and Columbia.
old land.
Yeah, I remember those days too.
And so that was an arrangement that we did, but I'll say as load fell across everybody's platform and as the market became more efficient in the integrated market piece, it was no longer a requirement for utilities such as that to take these one-off agreements to buy into these resources. And so I think from both of our perspectives, it worked better to, move on. And so really the market is where we generally buy and sell all of our power. So it's not any individual
Any one place.
place that's buying that.
Good.
And so it's really an efficient process.
It's more efficient that way.
It really is. It's that because we're all buying every second of the day, right? So every 5 seconds, there's a new price signal that gets sent out. So every 5 seconds. And so they're going to move our resources up and down based off of that price signal, not based off of how much consumption that we're using. So if we're flipping the switch on and prices are $10, Nearman's not going up to serve my load. Something else will serve that load. But as prices go up overall, even if I'm not using power, somebody else is willing to pay $50 a megawatt hour, and therefore we are willing to serve that at that price. So that's where the efficiency has come in with SPP making that market. So all of us, essentially our resources will fit into that space based off the cost of those resources. So on the second page, so this is the expense side of the entire utility. And so this is both the expenses for electric and water. So from a production standpoint, production costs are down about 9% from budget and about up 10% from last year. Again, purchase power and fuel are the two most volatile pieces of this. From a purchase power standpoint, we're about 9% lower than budget and about 30% lower than last year. But where we make that cost up is fuel use is in turn up. And that's where you see in those wholesale sales, right? Is we have to burn fuel to create wholesale sales is how that works. And so therefore our fuel use is up 87% over budget and up about 57% over last year. So purchase power and fuel move based on the market conditions. So if you have higher market prices, then your resources are going to operate more to serve that load. And if you have lower market prices, so generally market prices are set by natural gas. And so if you have really low natural gas pricing, then our resources generally won't operate as much because we'll buy off more efficient units, such as a Dogwood unit that we have a joint owned unit on. So it's one of the more efficient gas units. And so that would operate. But our coal unit or our fuel oil units wouldn't operate because the price in the market is really low. And so what we do expect going forward and what the EIA expects going forward is that we are in a long-term trend of higher natural gas prices. And so we are seeing both the growth in LNG or liquefied natural gas exports. So over the last handful of years, they've really ramped up the amount of capacity that can go out in liquefied natural gas form. And so the liquefied natural gas is sending this natural gas in liquid form to Europe, to Japan, to these type of places, because the cost of natural gas in those locations are sometimes 3 to 6 times higher than what we have in the United States. And so therefore, they will buy that liquefied natural gas at higher prices than we will domestically. And so there's pros and cons to all of that, but the more we ship overseas, the less is here domestically, which then means the price of natural gas domestically goes up,
Goes up.
right? So those are challenges that we all have to live with. But on the total operating expenses we're about 2% higher than budget and about 4% higher than last year. So not a great deal of change. And again, a lot of that's driven by those higher sales to the market itself, and therefore those higher wholesale sales. On an operating income standpoint, we're up about 28% higher than budget and about 15% higher than last year. So that's a good spot to be in overall. One thing I did want to point out before we leave is May particularly, even though we didn't talk about May specifically, we've talked about year to date, and we can get into May if we want to. May was a difficult month, and May is always a difficult month. If you look at any year on the sales side or the cash side, is because we as consumers just don't use as much power in May. And therefore, and we also do more of our maintenance items on our generating facilities in that May timeframe, right? So, which makes sense because prices are lower because none of us as consumers use as much. And then therefore it's not as in demand, and therefore we want to make sure that units are ready to go for summer conditions, right? And so we spend more money in May and we make less money in May. And so therefore it's generally a difficult month. For example, this May, our cash position was down $12.4 million from the previous month. That is a big number. That's about 20 days of cash is what that position is. And so, yes, it makes you swallow hard a little bit there. But with that said we have higher levels of fuel on the ground today than we did pre-outage. And so even though that is not cash, it will turn to cash as we move through summer conditions, right? And so today we are at, I can't even remember, 81 days. I think we're at 81 days of coal on the ground today. And so therefore, that's a good place to be as we enter into the summer season. Historically, on average, we'd like to probably say somewhere around 45 to 55 days, just as a general rule. But in some ways, it does make sense to have higher levels of coal to begin the summer. And then by the end of summer, that you're going to be on the low side of that 45 to 55 days because the trains will still stay on pace, but you'll be burning quicker than the coal trains are coming in. And then you'll probably catch back up a little bit in the fall for that winter season. And so that's kind of the ebb and flow of how cash and I'll say fuel on the ground works. And so just something to keep in mind. It is a rough position on the cash side a little bit. We still are going to sit somewhere near 100 days. And so that's where we would expect to be as part of the cost of service that we did a few years back. And so we had been hovering right at 120 days the last several months, which is where we want to be in 2027. But we anticipate over the next handful of months to start slowly gaining cash back as, again, these air conditioning costs roll through. And so therefore, starting in July, August, September, and October, that's really the best months for cash as these payments for summer usage starts coming back in. So
It was rough for me too.
yes, for all.
May was rough for me too. My mom's birthday, my dad's birthday, my birthday,
Happy anniversary.
my son's birthday. Thank you.
Happy anniversary, exactly.
Yeah, that was really
Yeah, today is our anniversary, 31 years.
Happy anniversary.
good.
31.
Amazing.
A long time.
50.
That's right. That's right. So on the electric side, we'll get down to the division itself. And so on the electric side, so on slide 3, one more. You're good. I'm sorry, keep going. There, one more. There we go. So on the electric side itself, and as I mentioned, electric really dominates the revenues overall. Water is much more consistent year to year than electric is. But on the residential side, residential revenue is down 3% from budget. And it's up 7% from last year. On the commercial side, and I know I don't have page numbers on these, but on the commercial side, we're up about 3% from above budget and down 1% from last year. And then similar to what we've seen on the whole company side is industrial sales are down about 12% to budget and 12% to last year. And again, largely driven by General Motors, but we are seeing lighter sales overall. When we look at the entire category for retail sales from a revenue standpoint, we're down 2% to budget, but we're flat with last year. So we're really right about where we would anticipate being overall on the electric side.
What is public authorities?
So as you see, there's $258 in that account. I should know better exactly who all makes up that account or who clearly doesn't make up that account. But I think it's tied to the unified government in some capacity. And I think it's tied to, they pay certain bills. Again, it is $258. So it's not a meaningful number. And so it's interesting that we do report it. But I think it's based on certain classifications of which they do pay for.
Thank you.
On the, again, the big driver in electric overall is really the wholesale market sales piece. And so the wholesale market piece for 2025 thus far is about 7.5 million compared to about 1.9 million last year and about 2.6 million in the budget. So that's a real driver of what changed the revenue side on the electric side is that wholesale market sales. And it's up strong this year. And so that's a good problem because again, that is somebody else paying money into the bucket that's not our retail customers, right? So the more that we can make money outside of retail customers, the better value we all receive from that. So when we look at the bottom of that page, the total operating revenues, so that includes, again, pole attachments, wholesale market sales, along with our retail sales. We're up about 8% over budget and about up 6% from last year. So overall revenues from the electric side are looking pretty good. And then next slide, please. So again, this is the electric side. Production costs, they're down about 9% from budget and up about 10% from last year. Again, a lot of production costs are driven by those outages that we've been experienced really in the month of May and partially in April. And so those are somewhat expected that we expect to smooth out over the course of the year because we get to more of a normal operating condition for the rest of the year. So we're in that spring outage and we're just coming out of that spring outage now. And so we do expect some smoothing of that. Again, purchase power and fuel, those are the two real volatile units. Purchase power is down 9% below budget and down about 30% from last year. Where the fuel side, again, the wholesale sales side, the production side is fuel is up 87% over budget and up about 57% from last year. And so effectively what that just means is that we're operating the resources more than we expected to, and purchase power costs are lower because market prices are higher. Therefore, we're operating versus purchasing off the market.
The term wholesale, there are certain people in this community that latch onto that. And they would, if they were to look at this and see wholesale, they're going to think somebody's getting a deal and we're not getting it. How can we explain that to these people that that's not
So
Margaritaville or somebody that's getting a special deal?
yes, so every customer that sits in our service territory here in Kansas City, Kansas, is you fall in one of those categories, right? So residential for us, residential customers, commercial for people like Margaritaville hotels, office buildings, those type of things. And then the industrial class is going to be those that make a product such as General Motors and CertainTeed and those types of groups. So they all have their rates associated with them and they pay for those rates. Wholesale is effectively the grid, the greater grid. We sit in the greater grid, just like Kansas City, Missouri sits in the greater grid, just like Omaha, Nebraska sits in that grid. And so the market as a whole sends price signals to all of us that operate within the grid. And so therefore, the price signal that SPP sends me tells me what resource should come on and what resource should come off, right? And so again, as market prices or wholesale prices go up, then my units are going to likely operate more because my units know exactly what their cost is to operate. And so if the market price is $50, for example, and my resource costs $25 to operate, I would turn that unit on because I would sell it for 25, right? My cost would be 25 and my revenue side would be $50, right? So we just made $25 per megawatt hour on that revenue side. And so we all live in that space. And so again, there are plenty of times when my resources don't operate. And so my wholesale sales, we actually report it in a different category as an expense. But effectively is when natural gas prices were sub $1 just a year ago, is my units didn't operate. Well, because my unit is $25 and units like a Dogwood facility, for example, could operate at $16. Well, there's no reason to turn on a unit that costs 25 if they're only going to pay me $16 for that power. And so therefore, I don't turn on my unit, and SPP through other resources, whether it be wind assets predominantly, right? So wind assets are going to generate at $0. And so therefore, hey, if they're generating at 0 and they sell it in and the market is $16, there's that $16 spread, right? We have purchase power agreements with our wind, so it's not exactly one for one, but effectively those resources bid into the market at that $0 level. And so it is nobody gets a deal. It's not one particular customer. It is essentially it's a collaboration and cooperation within the space, right? Instead of all of us trying to be our own world and our own entity, the power business is really this cooperative plus competitive nature that exists, right? So because we don't want our power to go out and then look across the river and say, hey, all their lights are on. Well, that's not very efficient, right? So the efficiency is that all of our power stays on across all this 14 state region is every power's on and they take the most efficient resources to turn those most efficient resources on. Pre-2007, each of us utilities that were, I'll say, load serving entities, essentially served our own load with our own resources. And so therefore, you only got the efficiency of the resources that we have in our portfolio. So this resource, this cost resource, and then this cost resource. Well, I don't want to turn on this cost resource because it's really expensive. Well, once I pass this threshold, I got to turn this resource on because it's my only resource left, right? And so the only thing it does differently now is it takes all the resources from all of us and stacks them all up in this row. And so now I'm only going to turn on the very next most efficient unit as loads get higher, right? And so as we get to summertime, yes, more of these resources have to come on because we're using tons of power. But as that load goes down, let's say at 9 p.m., this resource shuts off, this resource shuts off. And so it always is taking the most efficient power. And so it's the cheapest method of ensuring everybody's power stays on and it's really reliable system. And so the grid is meant to be reliable above all else, but it's always taken that most efficient resource. So yes, it is the wholesale side is really dictated by really two things. The amount of load on the system, so how much each of us are consuming collectively, and then really the price of natural gas. And so as natural gas prices change, that price within the market changes.
I would say, Tom, the just basic everyday user, a residential user, they don't probably understand the whole power,
I know they don't understand.
Southwest Power.
Yeah. But there are certain people that are out there
And they
that if they see that word, then they're going.
wholesale, they think it's going,
Somebody's getting a deal and they're not.
I
And I just,
understand
and
it,
I just think that it's good to be able to say, hey, nobody's getting a deal.
right,
That wholesale does not mean that, in the National Furniture Mart
right.
or
But
the,
I know that's what they're thinking. I know that's what they're
that,
thinking. But it's hard for me to even fathom the whole Southwest Power Pool and our,
but wholesale does not mean here like it, they're
Like-
interpreting.
exactly.
So anyway, we can go ahead.
No, that's a great question. That's a great question. I know we're trying on time a
5
little bit.
minutes For me.
So let's move to the water real quick. And so on the residential side, another slide, please. There you go. On the residential side, on the water side, year to date, we're flat to budget and we're up about 5% over last year on the residential side. Commercial side, we're down about 1% and we're up 4% overall on the commercial side from last year. On the industrial side, we're about 6% above budget and we're down about 10% from last year. And again, some of this is by the consumption of General Motors overall, and overall consumption levels are down just a bit. And so as we look at total retail sales, we're up about 1% from budget and up about 2% overall from last year. And so really, really close to budget overall through 5 months. And so that's a good place to be. And then when we look at total operating revenues there at the bottom, we are flat to budget and we're up 2% overall from last year. And so we're really right on place where we would expect to be at this time of year from a water revenue standpoint. On the expense side, next slide, please. On the production side of water, we're down about 13% below budget, but up about 10% from last year. And then on the transmission and distribution side, we're down about 5% below budget and up about 17%. Overall, in total operating expenses, we're down about 6% below budget, but about 10% higher overall. And so from a water perspective, we have seen a little bit higher, I'll say, wholesale sales again. So wholesale sales on the water side is a little bit different, right? So wholesale sales is when we sell it to outside communities that we produce water for as well. And so we have seen higher wholesale sales than we expected. And so at this point, wholesale sales on the water side have been about 504,000 compared to about 360,000 in budget. So that's a little bit higher than we had budgeted for. But again, that's a good problem. So we are still seeing wholesale sales up and that's a good problem because the production costs overall are relatively low for water. And it's really the materials and infrastructure that's the biggest success. On that note, I will take any questions that anybody has.
Thank you. I do have something, but not this related to the questions I've been asked. I will get it for you. Email I got from somebody. I'll get it for you.
So we're saying about 100 days of cash on hand.
Will be about 100 days of cash.
and this is on the consent agenda, is that correct?
That is the plan to put that on the consent agenda for May or for July.
July.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so,
What do we need to cover next
so
with this committee? Because I can't keep up with it.
no, and I think it's a great question. I think some of it is
And I've just let go of everything too, which is not very good on my part, but
what do we want to do? So for the next two regular sessions, we have the first quarter and the second quarter.
okay.
One of the things that we likely, I'd like to speak to is our credit rating and how we go about thinking about our credit rating and what it means and those type of things. The reason I say that is we talked about the debt side of it a few months back.
Right.
And so it's been a few years since we've issued debt, and I don't want debt to be something that we perceive as being debt is here because data center is here.
Mhm.
That is not one for one. We are considering debt issuances without the data center. And honestly, as part of the previous cost of service, we expected to do a a debt issuance in either 24 or 25. And so we are still considering those options in terms of whether debt makes sense. But as we think through the larger picture, now that we have data centers moving in a certain direction, we will revisit whether all of that makes sense on the same scale as before, or whether we probably look at this wider.
Let's look at that and let me know what you think, what your thoughts are. So now-
Yeah, no, we can have.
Stevie,
Absolutely.
happy anniversary. Tell your wife I said
I
so.
appreciate it.
Happy
I missed that forum you were at last night with Rose.
Oh, yeah.
But I just got sent a copy of it. It's good. It really.
Yeah, it was a nice turnout. It was good.
You guys.
Thank you, Steve.
And thank you so much.
Is that something that maybe we should do in a general work session so that every board member can hear it?
It probably wouldn't be a terrible idea. So if
Think
that's,
for credit rating, maybe we should.
that's a preference. So really, we likely get to the September meeting. So the September timeframe that would probably cause us to want to do another session over the July numbers, income statement. So that would be my expectation, is that we do one either the second meeting, and I guess in August, we could do the July financials, assuming we'll just have to put it late in the month to make sure that we get those Julys done.
Get them all done.
So we're really always tight on time. We're just finishing up the May actually just as we speak. So it's always tight, but we could.
I do think if we're gonna go out for debt, that the credit rating thing would be an interesting topic for everybody to hear.
Okay.
What about you? What, Tom, do you think that? Because some of these board members haven't experienced going
Yes.
over and
Yes.
asking for money.
It's been 2020 since we've
Yeah,
done an issuance. And so it is one of those things that, and even to me, is that it's somewhat new in terms of the process that, I've experienced. And so I think it's good just to kind of make everybody aware, even broader than obviously BPU, right?
exactly.
And again, this is where we will have discussions with the unified government, is making sure that everybody's comfortable with.
That would be another thing because they have so many different people,
Yes.
there too, that
Yes. And so just broadly speaking, we have a really good, I'll say, credit story, and we're actually going through that process now with both Moody's and Fitch. And so
They ought to be happy with us.
yeah,
Exactly.
they should be. And so we're in a better financial position than we've been for several years. And so I think overall, they're in a good state of mind with where we sit. Obviously, like everybody is, you bring up the idea of data center and the size of data centers. And so that is something that changes at least, the vantage point, because it's so big in scale relative to your straight line that we've been on for 20 years in terms of our load
Exactly.
profile. But with that said is, it's really a good problem. And I think the credit rating agencies will see that as well in terms of from the revenue standpoint, those type of things. But like anything is, they got to get comfortable with that as well. So. But no, I think that's a good topic to take through, and I'll take that up to Chris and Jeremy.
It could be on a work scheduled day, that's the second Wednesday. Yeah,
So I think we can
so that,
look at that.
others could attend. I think it would be a good topic for everybody to.
Yeah, I don't disagree. So,
And again, one of the topics that seems to keep coming up, or has been recently with a certain segment of our community, is the ERC. And for some reason, they think they're getting screwed.
Oh, because it isn't paid back until.
They don't I don't know that they that it's totally understood how that works and how,
Well, it is complicated.
It is complicated.
It is.
And
And why they perceive that every they don't see the getting the money back. They see that they've been overcharged.
And so,
How do we,
Can't
how do
imagine
you explain?
How many people really even look that frequently at there? Well, now you can just look at your usage. You can get online.
Oh, they listen in and they to a meeting or and they hear that, we have an over ERC.
Yeah.
And they don't really understand how all that works.
and it is complicated and my argument a little bit is that and we are collectively looking at all customers within our service territory, right? So industrial customers, commercial customers, residential customers, all pay the exact same freight for the energy rate component. That is a cents per kilowatt hour standpoint. One of the things to keep in mind is that price signals change every 5 seconds. And we are effectively taking the entire portfolio of all of our customers into these costs that are spent here. Those dollars that may be at this point over collected, right? And we may get to an under collected standpoint here in another quarter. And therefore, you're not in a rush to pay those back at that point, right? But these are not necessarily any one individual's dollars. Is we as residential customers generally have the worst load profile of any customer class. And so therefore, we generally consume the highest price energy, where industrial customers generally consume the lowest price energy because their profile looks different. With that said I charge industrial customers and commercial customers just as much as I charge residential customers, even though as a general rule, us residential customers have that worse load profile. And therefore, any individual house, whether I'm a super high, I'll say air conditioning user, I'm likely actually maybe not contributing enough compared to an industrial customer. But collectively, we look at it as a total system cost because you cannot break it down into 5-second segments in terms of you did this, this guy did that. You did this guy did this. And so each of us it is just a collection. It's kind of like the grid in general is at some point, just like the residential class is, we all pay the exact same thing on the residential class, right? We all pay the exact same dollar per kilowatt hour, but we don't consume power exactly the same way as our neighbor consumes it. Do I consume more? Do I consume less? Do I consume power at the most expensive time or the least expensive time? So generally, just like anything it is a generalization, just like the individual rate classes are a generalization, that generally we act in the same manner, and therefore generally we should pay the exact same thing. And so instead of saying, Mary, and go to full, I'll say, market rates, right? So every second of the day, you are looking at your app to say, hey, it's $42 this second, it's $45 now. Should I shut off my light? It's $52. We're not at a place where any of us are, I'll say, able to portray actual every 5-second market conditions to each of our units. But also, I don't think we as a community or society want that level of detail in terms of every 5 seconds get an update on my phone that says, it's now $50, it's now $40, it's now $30. Because cooking that chicken in the oven, it's like, well, yes, it went up to $60, but that means it cost me an extra 4 cents to cook that chicken, not $40, right? So it's very, very small marginally. And therefore, you don't want that level of detail to consume your world for 4 cents this hour or 3 cents that hour, those type of things. But
It's just, they're triggered by the word wholesale. And they're triggered by the fact that they think we made deals with.
And that we're making money, we're making interest,
Yeah.
collecting interest money on money that they've been charged.
Always been that way.
And it's only I think it's a small number of people.
Well, having to pay
But
back the Monarch thing, but that just didn't set well with the people that knew it and knew about it. most of the people don't know. I mean, or they don't care. But there's a few that they're gonna question every little.
Yeah, and so I do think the way the energy rate component is set up is really the most efficient process and likely the best process.
It's quarterly,
It
right?
is quarterly.
Okay,
Could we speed it up to every 2 months? We technically could. I don't think the value exists to do so. Essentially, and you're gonna sit on both sides of that equation, right? So I
Exactly.
under collect half the time and I over collect half the time.
exactly.
So it's any given month I sit on one side or the other in terms of, hey, you now owe me. Do I now charge you interest for
Oh, yeah.
you not? It's essentially operating a business and your cash position essentially moves back and forth. And so we're all in this kind of collective pool of people, and that's how the grid works. And that's what makes the grid so good, is that we don't have to now put coal in our own furnace down in the basement to say,
Yeah,
hey, I operate. We can all live our lives and have the greater grid service. And that's why it's so reliable, really cost effective, honestly, if you look at it from a $4.50, something like that per day. It is an amazing machine. And I think we're fortunate to have it just collectively in the country, and we pay lower utility rates than any other country really in the world.
right.
So it is, but we also understand that, rates matter, costs matter, and we've got to keep driving to do those things. And again, getting back to the data center piece a little bit, is we firmly believe that bringing on more revenue from these large customers will absolutely help out every other customer class and utilize the system more efficiently. So we do feel really good that these customers will help all of us in the future.
I think that's the message I've been trying to portray, but I mean, in the past, I've sometimes, not twisted arms of commissioners that I've known, but I've kind of just really stayed out of the fray. I haven't called anybody. I haven't, I'm hoping that there's been enough communication, I think, to,
I move we adjourn.
okay. We're not supposed to be talking about that.
I don't know. We can talk about.
Well, we didn't call the order, so we can go whenever we want to go. I don't think we're like
You want to stop me?
now.